going to be talking about free response questions in AP Psychology exam, especially the evidence-based questions. So we can see here it's labeled as EBQ. It means evidence-based. So before we get into the question today, I want us to look at first the question instructions, because this will look the same on the exam. All of the EBQ evidence-based questions will have the same format. It will ask you to do exactly the same thing, but with different topics. It will ask you to solve the question using different things that you have learned in AP Psychology, but the concept is quite similar. It will have 3 sources of research findings, as you can see here. Every source will have the same format. It will consist of introduction, participants, method, and results and discussion. As you can see here as well, there's a source 3, there's introduction, participants, method, results and discussion. Sometimes it will be a graph like this, sometimes it would just be words, right? As we can see here, sometimes it would just be statistic numbers. After we've seen all of these very, very long research findings, we might get confused. Okay, so I've read all of this, what do you want me to do? A College Board is suggesting that you need to use around 45 minutes to solve the questions. Here are the questions. There will be 3 main questions, and during the computer-based exam you'll be given 3 chat boxes that you can put in your answers. So you'll be given 1 box for A, and then you move on to B, and then you write down B1 and B2 in 1 box, and then you write down C1 and C2 in another box. It looks very easy, right? And that is a tricky point, because people think that this is the easy part, because all it says is to propose a question and then support your claim using the specific evidence that you get from the sources, which is the research findings that you read, and then explain it using the things that you've learned in AP Psychology, using your own words, right? So it seems pretty easy, but the problem is that sometimes when students are studying for AP Psychology, it is very difficult for them to actually apply things that they've learned. There are so many different special terms, basically everything with the personality development, psychotherapy. There are so many different words, and when we're focusing on memorizing the vocabulary, sometimes it's easy for us to just forget about how we can use it in real life. And this is what this question is about. It's not only about testing your ability to read through research findings and summarize them, but it's also important for them to test you how much can you actually explain the things that you've learned in AP Psychology and applying it to real life examples. So one word of advice when students are studying for the key terms is that when you're finishing studying, for example, a module, think about that you have to explain it to somebody who didn't study psychology, know nothing about psychology. The beauty of psychology is that it's connected to human beings. There's always an emotional and social aspect of it. So there are so many different ways that we can apply them. So one of the ways that we can learn about how to apply these examples is to read through the book, whether it's a Barron textbook or any materials that you have on AP Psychology, and not only focus on the term explanations, the basic terminologies, but also how they're using it application in real life. What are people actually researching them about? The research is always connected to the real life. You can also test yourself by saying like, hey, what if you meet a friend? What if your mother brings you to a party and then you have a friend that has some problems that want you to solve? You can say, oh, I've learned about it in AP Psychology, for example. Sleep deprivation has a very bad impact on your memory. Maybe if your son is in high school and you want him to have better grades, it's better for him to have more sleep, So think about how you would explain it to a normal person who doesn't know AP psychology, who doesn't know the terms sleep deprivation, but you can explain to them like that, right? We need to have good quality sleep. We need to have adequate enough sleep for us to have good cognitive functioning. So that is one of the advice that I wanted to give before we get into this evidence-based questions about learning strategies. So you have to know your terms, that's the basic, and also you have to be able to recall the terms when you're doing the exam, which is a little bit more difficult because you're stressed, because you're in a different environment. And you have to be able to recall all the terms that you've learned. Think about it like a map. Recall the terms that you've learned, how they're connected to each other, and how to apply it and explain it in real life. So this is the study strategy part. And I also wanted to point out that key terms that we want to focus on, for example, propose, support, explain, right? This is the same here. So basically C and B, you can look at them as if they're the same question, but you have to use different parts of the evidence and different psychology terms to solve it, but they are it's very similar. What they're asking you to do is similar. So these are the task verbs. We can see that you have to respond to the task verbs, and you have to understand what the task verb means. So propose a specific and defensible claim. This will always be like this, okay? So when you see an EBQ, the first question is always going to be use a specific and defensible claim based in psychological science that responds to the question. The difference will be that this argument will be different. So they're asking you to use the sources provided to develop and justify an argument about something. This something will change, okay? But this question will always look like this, the response to the question. So we want to make a specific and defensible claim. What is a claim? A claim is an opinion. This opinion has to be connected to the things that we're reading here, but you cannot copy and paste. You cannot use the results or the summary of the research as the claim because it's already stated in the research. So you have to propose a claim that first you can find findings here in the sources that support the claim. And two, you have to use your own words. It has to be something that's defensible, which means that it has to have actual content. Something is right, something is wrong. You should do something. Think about it as you're using the word should. When we're solving this kind of questions, what we can do is to read through the questions first, since we already know what the questions will be like. If you study for the exam, you know what the questions will read. So the key point here is to read this part, which is the key terms, the things that we want to write about, the three sources, they are all about this. So after we read this part, the age at which parents should first allow their children to be exposed to media screens, we can quickly think about what we have learned so far. So this is cognitive development at an early age. First of all, there's a brain plasticity. That means that it's changeable, it's vulnerable to influences. It's plastic. Plastic means that it's like soft and it's moldable. Like it's easy to change, right? So we can say that young children, they are more subjective to this kind of media influences because of brain plasticity. We can also say that in John Piaget's stage theory, right, there's a sensory motor stage that's 0 to 2 years old. So we can talk about the age more specifically in the explanation part, because we know that sensory motor stage is 0 to 2 years old. And there's something called object permanence in this theory. That means that this child successfully goes through the sensory motor stage. They can understand that an object is permanent. It's always there, even if they're not seeing it, or even if it's hidden behind something else, right? So we can say that according to John Piaget's stage theory, object permanence should be developed between the age 0 and 2, and exposure to media screens might influence this object permanence development. We also learn about Erikson's psychosocial stage theory, but that is more about emotional development. So when you think about this, it's more about cognitive development to exposing to media screens. So you can put it in the note if you want to incorporate the Erikson's stage theory, because we don't know if it's really about cognitive development yet. Maybe we can talk about the emotional development or emotional attachment to the parents. Jot down everything that we've thought about, that can be helpful for us, especially that's concerning the specific age children are developing. And then you can go back to read the research. All right. So when we're reading research, we have to have a specific goal in mind, and that goal is to get to know what the research is about and how it's relating to the question, which is the age at which parents allow their children to be exposed to media screens. So we have that question in mind, and then we start reading these words. It becomes a lot easier for us to find out the keyword. When infants first experience media screens, how often they are exposed, and their cognitive development. Okay, that's something that we want, right? Okay. Mother's educational levels. That has nothing to do with the age they're first exposed to media screens. We won't underline that, right? So in the research, there might be things that seems to have nothing to do with the question. At that point, you can just leave it there. And if you want to go back and read it again, we always have the time because we have 45 minutes to solve these questions. That's more than enough time, right? We can first scan it, underline things that we think is helpful, that we want, that has something to do with the question. That's the first step. Okay. It's a longitudinal study, Then ask their mothers how much time their infant was exposed to a media screen, measured this, okay. Results, that's the most important part. It occurred at 1 month, that's pretty early. So here, the relationship between high levels of screen time and cognitive development were especially strong among participants who were first exposed to screen media at an early age. Okay, so this is something that has all of the keywords, right? Early age, exposure to media, cognitive development. Okay, that's all we need. Okay, we can do the same thing to source 2. And here sometimes they'll give you a lot of the details about the research methods. It's not there to confuse you, so this is not to trick you, but you have to understand what you're looking for. So this is how they measure the children's cognitive abilities. There are so many different tests that they're doing, right? But that has nothing to do at this point with screen exposure and cognitive development. So here we can see that researchers find a negative correlation. Negative correlation means that the more time you spend on screen results in less accuracy in the cognitive tasks. Source 3, it says that it is statistically significant. We can see that the mean and the media screen exposure goes down when the media screen time goes up, right? So that's all we need. Okay, so going back to the questions. Let's look at how they're grading it. So the first question is to write a claim that meets the criteria. You can say something like, infants should not be exposed to media screens until they are several years old. You can say 2, you can say 3, it doesn't really matter. Infants exposed to large amounts of media screens in later elementary school. so they will not have deficits in cognitive development. So I think there should be a should here. Should be exposed to media screens after a certain time. The later the infants spend with media screens, the better their cognitive development will be in early childhood. So this is all talking about the relationship between cognitive development and the age, right? Age at which parents should first allow their children to be exposed to media screens. So as long as it's aligning with the things that they're asking for, it's good. For B, we have to cite the source, and for citation, we can just simply say according to source 1 or according to source 2. That's pretty simple. But keep in mind that you have to cite it in some way, reference source, to show that you understand that this question is asking you to cite the source. So what we can say is that source 1 finds that blah, 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 blah. You cannot copy and paste what's written in source 1 summary results. You are not allowed to do that, but you can just paraphrase it using your own words. For example, what did source 1 say? I'm going to go back to source 1. If a participant exposed to screen media at an early age, then the relationship between high levels of screen time and cognitive development were especially strong. So the relationship between the screen time and development. But is it a positive or negative relationship? If the participants are exposed considered a high level, then they are scored lower for motor skill and visual reception scales, right? So we can see here that it is a negative relationship. After you're reading this, try to find out what the relationship is, and then using your own words to say it. You don't necessarily have to use negatively correlated or positively correlated, high level, low scores, right? And then for B2, we have to explain it. And by explaining, the easiest way is to use because. So you can say, according to source 1, the things that we found so far, according to Piaget's stage theory, children are developing object permanence. Source 1. Keep in mind this is 2 points, okay? So all the C2 and B2 questions are worth 2 points. Source 1's finding that visual memory is lower when students are exposed to high levels of screen media could relate to how and when toddlers master object permanence. So this is just source 1's finding that, and then you can say it's connecting it to the things that you've learned with your own words. Then you can explain it a little bit more. If their memory for visual information is lower, then they may have challenges developing object permanence. So as long as it makes logical sense. And for C1 and C2, they're basically the same as B1 and B2. The thing is that you cannot use what you have cited before. So if you use, for example, source 1 in B, then you have to use source 2 or source 3 in C. And then you have to use a different thing. You cannot use object permanence again. You have to use something else. So the formula is pretty much similar, right? The study support the claim that blah, blah, blah. You can say impaired cognitive development because the brain does not become proficient in processing other forms of sensory. You can say the lower ability to use mental imagery to present external development shows that may have mastered the concrete operational stage of Piaget's developmental theory.